Right, we're going to review our atrial rhythms and how we name them. And so first we need to understand where our atrial rhythms are coming from. So why are they different than sinus? So we know that in a sinus rhythm, our pacemaker site is the SA node. That electrical conduction passes through the internodal pathways to the AV node, also passes through the Bachmann's bundle over to the left side. But from there, it's going to go to the internodal pathways to the AV node, and then that conduction is going to go down through the bundle of His, then to each bundle branch and out to the Purkinje fibers. In an atrial rhythm, we have some type of excited cell myocyte in the atrium, whether it be the left or right, that gets excited, and it can either fire off prematurely, which would give us our PAC. It could fire off regularly, which would give us our A flutter, or it could fire off all over the place, very excited, which would give us our AFib, which we see down here. So we have all of these different irritated sites in the atrium that are going off. And what happens with this AFib is that these are firing off rapidly, causing fibrillation, and then every once in a while one of those conduction is going to get through down to the AV node, where then the signal can spread through the rest of the ventricles. That's why it's irregular. We get all these fib waves. So my atria will be firing off randomly, and then all of a sudden a signal gets through. It's going to fire off randomly, and a signal gets through a little sooner. It's going to fire off randomly, and then maybe it takes a little longer. And that's why our atrial fibrillation is very irregular. So let's take a look at our first rhythm here. This is off a cardiac monitor, so it gives me a heart rate. So my heart rate is 54 beats per minute. And one thing I want to notice about this, is it regular or irregular? This rhythm is regular. It looks pretty regular. Is my P waves upright? Are they normal looking? Well, no. If I look closely, I have multiple P waves for my QRS. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's one here, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 5 P waves for every one QRS. So I write that as a 5 to 1. I have 5 P waves for 1 QRS. These are called flutter waves. So if I go back up to my heart diagram here, what I have is I have an irritated spot in my atria that's firing off 5 times before that signal gets down to the AV node and gets passed on through the conduction system in the ventricles. All right, next thing I want to look at is my QRS. My QRS is narrow, so that means it is coming from above the ventricles, so it's not a ventricular rhythm. And I know my rate already is 54. Doesn't look like I have any ST changes, so my J point is here on my QRS, and then I kind of go right back into those flutter waves. So the name of this rhythm is Atrial Flutter. Because I have those flutter waves, because it's an atrial rhythm and we don't write atrial fibrillation bradycardia or atrial flutter tachycardia, we just label it controlled or uncontrolled. So controlled is going to be a rate that has an average of under 100 beats per minute. Uncontrolled is going to be an atrial rhythm that has an average rate over 100 beats per minute. And because this is a monitor printout, I have my average heart rate here, which is 54, which is well below the 100 beat per minute. So this is going to be controlled A flutter. And I like to put controlled versus uncontrolled at the beginning. You can put it at the end with your octapete, and that is also acceptable. So I have controlled A flutter at 54 beats per minute. And the extra thing that I need to add with this rhythm is my conduction ratio. We should put a conduction ratio if the conduction ratio is not 1 to 1. So anytime our conduction ratio is not 1 P wave to 1 QRS, we should put a conduction ratio. So this is going to be atrial flutter with a conduction ratio of 5 to 1. So controlled A flutter at 54 beats per minute with a 5 to 1 conduction ratio. Let's look at the next rhythm. First of all, I need to decide my regular, irregular, and this is irregular. So anything that's irregular and narrow, I should already be getting these kind of red flags off for AFib, because AFib is typically always irregular. It's our only rhythm that is irregularly irregular, meaning that it not only is it irregular, but there's no pattern to it at all. Next, I need to figure out my rate, so I'm going to see how long the strip is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So not quite a 6-second strip. So I'll have to figure out my rate here. And because it's irregular, I should really do a rate that gives me a range. So to figure out my slowest rate, I'm going to look between my widest RR interval, which seems to be here. This one here. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. So 1500 divided by 28 gives me 53.5, so 54 beats per minute. Now I'm going to figure out my fastest rate, so I want to take where they're closest together, and it looks like this one, the first two complexes are going to be my closest. 5, 10, 15, 16, 17. And that gives me a rate of 88. My QRSs are narrow. I might have some ST depression here, but it looks like it's only one block, so I'm not too concerned about it, and I won't add that in my ectopy. So I have my rate. I know it's atrial. Let's take a look at our P waves. Do we have any definable P waves? I definitely don't see any P waves here. I definitely see flutter waves, so I definitely have that, irregular shaking kind of fibrillation of the atrium going on there. So I'm going to label this atrial fibrillation. My rate is at 54 to 88 beats per minute. Now I need to decide, is this controlled or uncontrolled? Because with atrial fibrillation, we don't label it tachy or brady. We label it controlled or uncontrolled. And basically what that is saying is my rate controlled by the AV node? Is my AV node slowing down the conduction enough that I'm not getting a tachyarrhythmia with these atrial rhythms? So since my rate is 54 to 88 beats per minute, my average is going to be somewhere in between there, but it's definitely under 100, so this is going to be controlled. So I have controlled atrial fibrillation at 54 to 88 beats per minute. All right, looking at this next rhythm, this is a 12 lead. It does give me a heart rate up here. My heart rate is 34. 12 lead is going to be looking at all different sections of the heart. So if I look down here, I have a lead 2 printout down here. So this gives me a consistent look at lead 2. Just glancing at my rhythm, is it regular or irregular? So I'm going to mark the tops of my RRs because I know it's a little difficult to see on this photocopy. But just glancing at it, it looks pretty regular. When I look at my P waves, it looks like I have multiple P waves per QRS. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it looks like I have 6 P waves per QRS. So I have a 6-to-1 conduction ratio. And when I look at these waves, I see this sawtooth pattern. These are flutter waves, which leads me to believe that this is atrial flutter. I have my rate, because it's up here, 34 beats per minute, which is very slow. And I have my conduction ratio that I counted out. So I just write 6-to-1. You don't have to write conduction ratio. But remember, anytime we have more P waves than QRSs, we have to put that conduction ratio. So I have atrial flutter at 34 beats per minute with 6-to-1 conduction ratio. Now I need to mark, is it controlled or uncontrolled? This is definitely controlled. It's way below 100, almost too controlled here. This patient is probably very sick. So controlled atrial flutter at 34 beats per minute with a 6-to-1 conduction ratio. All right, let's take a look at this rhythm. This next one here. So looking at it, is it regular or irregular? Well, it looks irregular. I have some beats that look out of place right there and there, but my underlying rhythm kind of looks pretty regular, right? Yeah. So here's my RRs. They all seem to march out okay. I have one P wave for QRS. My P waves are all upright. They all look the same except for these two. These two look different, but they also coincide with my beats that seem to come early. When I look at my underlying rhythm here though, my PR interval is normal, my QRS is narrow, I have a normal T wave, so this is telling me that this underlying rhythm is a sinus rhythm. And this is a 6-second strip, so I'm just going to use the 6-second technique to count out this rate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I wanted to be more exact, I could count out between two normal beats. So 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, maybe 19. Let's go ahead and figure out what 1500 divided by 19 is. So it gives me about 78.9. So technically we should, if we want to be more exact, we could put 79 beats per minute. Just make sure on these ones, when you're counting rate, you're counting the rate of the underlying rhythm. And I know this is the underlying rhythm here because it's what appears throughout most of the strip. So I have a sinus rhythm at 79 beats per minute. I don't have any ST segment changes, so I don't have to worry about that. It's a sinus rhythm, it's not Brady, it's not tacky. But I do have these early beats, and these beats come prematurely because they come early in the progression. And then my P waves also look different, which means it's probably coming from somewhere else in the atria. So I'm getting normal conduction from my SA to my AV down to my ventricles, and every once in a while, prematurely, I'll have an irritated spot in the atria firing off. We call that a premature atrial contraction. So we have a sinus rhythm at 79 beats per minute with PACs, which stands for premature atrial contractions. All right, let's look down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is a 6-second strip. It stops right there. When I look here, it looks like it's a little bit irregular, but here seems to march out pretty well, and then looks like I have a beat that comes early. And again, it looks slightly different than this one. My QRS is a little smaller, my P wave is a little smaller, so that beat is a little bit different than the rest. I have another one here where it looks like comes early in the progression. So again, my underlying rhythm is regular, but overall, this strip is irregular. But let's take a look at my underlying rhythm. And I put S's under them because they're coming from the SA node, they're sinus. I have a nice P wave, a narrow QRS, a normal T wave, no ST deviation, my J point's right on the isoelectric line. My PR interval is normal, so everything is screaming sinus, but I need to find out what the rate for my underlying rhythm is. This one ends right on a nice thick line, so I'm going to use this one to count from. So I have 5, 10, 15, 20, 21. So 1500 divided by 21 gives me a rate of 71 beats per minute. So I have a sinus rhythm at 71 beats per minute. And again, I have these two beats that seem to come early. So these are going to be my premature atrial contractions. And I can tell because not only do they look slightly different, but they come early in the normal progression. So I have a sinus rhythm at 71 beats per minute with PACs. All right, so this next strip, when I glance at this next strip, I see that it's definitely irregular. There's no pattern to it. And so I have an irregular rhythm that has no pattern at all, and I have narrow QRS complexes. So my QRS is narrow, meaning it's not coming from the ventricles. So I should already start thinking AFib, because irregular rhythms that have no pattern at all and narrow QRSs are typically going to be atrial fibrillation. So the next part I can look at to confirm this diagnosis is my P waves. And if I look between these QRS complexes, I definitely have those fib waves. So it's just, random shaking going along those isoelectric lines. Now, if you look between this one and this one, your first two QRSs, a lot of people will look at this and they'll try to turn this into a flutter. But the reason it's not a flutter, there's two reasons. One, these waves are not all the same. So with a flutter, our waves should generally look very similar to each other because they're coming from the same irritated spot in the atria. Another reason that makes this not a flutter is that I would have these flutter waves, if I were to call those flutter waves, I would have them throughout, and I definitely don't. Definitely very unorganized, definitely just fibrillation of the atria. So that is going to be atrial fibrillation. I'm going to abbreviate that as AFib. Next, I need to find out what my rate is, and since it is irregular, we're going to do a range. So it looks like this is going to be my shortest interval. Either one of these, they look about the same. So 5, 10, 11, I have 11 blocks through here, so it's going to be my fastest rate. And then it looks like this one over here might be my slowest rate. 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Got 22 little blocks through there. So let's go ahead and figure out our rates. So I got 1500 divided by 22 gives me a rate of 68. And then 1500 divided by 11 gives me a rate of 136. I don't have any ST changes. It would be hard to tell some ST changes on AFib. We'll look at an example of that a little bit later on. But I need to decide, is this controlled or uncontrolled? So one way we can do this is we're just going to take the average rate and see if it's over 100 beats per minute. So this is where you want to look at your 6-second strip to see how many do I have in that 6 seconds. So I'm going to start here, and 6 seconds is going to be 30 big blocks across. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. So this actually probably is a 6-second strip because we have half a block and half a block over here. So let's take my average, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So my average is 90 beats per minute. So this would be a controlled AFib. And the reason it's controlled is my average rate is below 100 beats per minute. It's only 90 beats per minute. So even though when in my faster section it is over 100, my average stays below 100 beats per minute and 90. So this is going to be controlled AFib. All right, next one. Regular or irregular. So this definitely looks irregular. It's not as blatantly irregular, but it is irregular. So it looks like it's a little fast here, slows down, fast, slow. So we're just going to call that irregular. So it is irregular, there's no pattern to it, and I have narrow QRSs. So I should already be thinking AFib. I can confirm that by looking at my P waves, and I definitely don't have any P waves that stick out, but I do have a lot of fibrillation waves along where the P wave should be. See how we have that line shaking there, that fibrillation. It's a little more fine than the one above it, but it still is fibrillation. So this is also going to be a fib. Now I want to control or figure out my rate. So it looks like my shortest section is going to be here. So I have 5, 10, 15. I have 16 blocks in between. Let's look for my longest section. Looks like my longest section is going to be over here. 5, 10, 15, 19, 20, 21, 22. All right, so that's going to help me give me my rate because it is irregular. I need to do a range. There's no underlying regular rhythm here that I can count a rate on. So 1500 divided by 22 gives me that 68. And then 1500 divided by 16 gives me a rate of 94. 93.75, we'll round that up to 94 beats per minute. So controlled or uncontrolled, well, I never get really over 100 beats per minute, so we can just go ahead and label this one controlled. We don't have to figure out an average there. And then do I have any ectopy here? So here's my J point. So my J point ends on that isoelectric line, but you can see my T wave is inverted because we go from that J point, which is maybe a block below, but not enough to call it ST depression, and my T wave is upside down. So we need to note that. So I've controlled a fib at 68 to 94 beats per minute with inverted T waves. All right, next rhythm. So I definitely have one beat that's sticking out to me because it looks like it's coming early. If I march out these, that looks pretty regular there. And then when I come over here, that all looks pretty regular there. So my underlying rhythm is regular, but I have one beat that seems to come early. So that one is going to be my premature beat. So let's look at my underlying rhythm to name our rhythm. I've got one P wave for every QRS complex. All my P waves are upright. They all look the same. My QRS is narrow. My PR interval is good. So everything about this is saying sinus rhythm. Now I need to figure out what type of sinus rhythm by counting my rate. 5, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, maybe 22 blocks across. I already did that math up here. It gives me 68 beats per minute. And then I have this one premature contraction. I know that it's coming from above the AV node because it has a P wave, it has a narrow QRS. So we're going to call that a PAC. So I have a sinus rhythm at 68 beats per minute with a premature atrial contraction. All right, looking at this next one. So right off the bat, I do see that it is regular. I do see that I have these flutter waves. So when I'm looking for my P waves, I note that I have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I have 3 P waves for every QRS complex, and I can tell they're flutter waves because they all look pretty much the same. They're all the same shape. They all look very similar to each other. So this is going to be atrial flutter. I need to figure out my rate, and my rate, remember, is your ventricle rate, because the ventricle, the QRS complex is what represents the ventricles depolarizing or contracting, and that contraction of the ventricles is what creates a pulse. So I'm going to start here because this one ends like right on a large line, which makes it easier. So I have 5, 10, 15, 20, 21, 22, 23 blocks across. So 1500 divided by 23, that gives me a rate of 65. And remember with this, because I have more P waves than QRSs, I have to put that conduction ratio. And then because it's atrial, I need to know, is this controlled or uncontrolled? Well, my rate is very regular and it's only 65 beats per minute, which is well below 100 beats per minute. So this is going to be controlled. So I have a controlled A flutter at 65 beats per minute with a 3:1 conduction ratio. Now keep in mind your conduction ratio could be variable. It would make your A flutter look irregular. And what would cause a variable conduction ratio is that I just wouldn't have the same amount of flutter waves between each complex. So a variable conduction ratio, I could have 3 and then my QRS, and then maybe 2 and then a QRS, and then maybe 4 and then a QRS. So I would still have those flutter waves. I just wouldn't have the same amount between each QRS. And instead of writing a conduction ratio, I would just write variable conduction ratio at the end there. So I did just want to make a note of that. All right, last rhythm here. So looking at this rhythm, oh, it looked pretty regular, and then, oop, this guy comes early, and then we're going back to regular. So my underlying rhythm is regular. And so I know that my underlying rhythm is what I need to label. So we're going to look at the underlying rhythm first. So I have a P wave for every QRS complex. My P waves are all upright. I have one for every QRS. My PR interval looks normal. It's within that 0.12 to 0.2 seconds. And all of my QRSs are narrow. Very narrow, actually, only about one block. So my underlying rhythm here is going to be a sinus rhythm. Let's go ahead and figure out my rate. So this one ends right on a line, so this is the one I'm going to count. 5, 10, 15, 20. Wow, that was perfect. So I have 20 small blocks across. So when I do 1500 divided by 20, it gives me a rate of 75 beats per minute. Let's take a look at my ST segment to see if I have any actipies. So my QRS ends here, which is right on the isoelectric line, and then it goes up into the T wave. My T wave looks normal. It's not peaked. It's not tall. So I have no actipy there, so I don't need to put anything there. But I do need to label this beat right here. So this beat, my P wave does look a little different, and it seems to come early in the progression. So it's premature. So it's a sinus rhythm with a PAC, because I got a premature atrial contraction.